Uh, so as Judy mentioned, when we started talking about me speaking here today, we realized it was right before Halloween, and there's an obvious correlation between that and a service that we do called Oban. That's the Japanese name. It's also called Ulambana in many Buddhist traditions. And so I'm going to refer to it by Ulambana because it's just more common. So the central activity of an Ulambana service is what we call feeding the hungry spirits. And you can also translate that as ghosts or shades. When someone lives a life consumed by greed or craving, from addictions, that sort of thing, then when they pass away, they might become a hungry ghost. That craving can take form and be reborn in the form of a hungry spirit. So these are spirits that live in a lower realm. I'll show you an image here. So they're often depicted as having small mouths, skinny necks, cavernous bellies. And so it's really hard for them to get full. And to make things worse, whenever they try to eat, their food turns to something disgusting or harmful, unless they're receiving the food as an offering from someone devout. So you don't have to believe that that's literally true. People often ask me, do you really believe in hungry ghosts? I don't answer that question. But we can recognize that giving ourselves over to craving can lead us to a bad place. And we can also recognize how there are many other people who suffer because of their own cravings. And we can vow to help them if we can. And in the process, we realize that compassion, our own compassion, our kindness and care benefits us spiritually, but it also benefits those who are less fortunate. So we actually include feeding the hungry ghosts in every Sunday service at White Sands Buddhist Center. But the Ulambana service is dedicated specifically to remembering our ancestors, departed friends, and teachers, and to helping those who are in very dire circumstances to transcend the realm in which they currently reside, however you want to look at that. So Ulambana services are pretty universal across Buddhist traditions, but they can take different forms. In China and some other Asian countries, for instance, they observe something they call Ghost Month. The gates of hell are said to open on the first day of Ghost Month. So ghosts can wander the world and go to their former homes. And in the process, during that period of time, they're freed from the suffering that they experience as ghosts. As you know, there are other faith traditions that have periods something like this. So All Souls Day, the commemoration of all faithful departed and things like that. Halloween is related to this idea more or less. So while this is fairly universal in Buddhist cultures, this commemoration of departed ancestors happens at slightly different times from one place to another because they use different calendars. So in Japan, Oban is one day that falls in the middle of August. In China, the Ghost Festival, which is the climax of Ghost Month, generally takes place in the summer. One of my teachers encourages us to adapt our holiday observances to our cultural circumstances. So we traditionally will do feeding of the hungry ghosts on the week leading up to Halloween. So regardless of what you call it or what day it falls on, it's an opportunity to practice gratitude toward our parents and our departed ancestors. The name of the observance, Ulambana, is taken from the title of a discourse called the Ulambana Sutra, a scripture in which the Buddha talks about how we might be able to repay our parents for the care that they gave us. So traditionally, the Buddha gave this discourse, and so the idea is that it would have appeared in India first, but scholars today say it was probably actually written in Chinese around the 6th century, which was several hundred years, actually 1,000 years or so after the Buddha's death. In any case, it has since become an integral part of Buddhist practice in many places because it teaches two important concepts: the benefits of filial piety and the value of generosity. And the ceremonies that grew out of it give us an opportunity to practice both of those. So I'll tell you the story of the Ulambana Sutra. It's not very long. So the Buddha had two key disciples, and let me just show you this. So you see, so this is the altar at Wat Florida Dhammaram, which is a Thai temple in Kissimmee. And if you see on either side of the Buddha, these kneeling figures, so one of those is Sariputta and the other is Moggallana. And these are his two most high-ranking disciples during their lives. And so in a lot of temples, you'll see those gold statues as two smaller statues of monks on either side of the Buddha. Sariputta is on the Buddha's right and Moggallana is on his left. So according to the Ulambana Sutra, Moggallana, Sariputta, and the Buddha were all staying at the same monastery. And Moggallana was a very advanced meditator. He had developed some psychic powers and stuff like that. So he decided one day that he was going to find out during meditation, he would go look for his parents and see where they had ended up. They were both deceased, and he wanted to see where they had been reborn. So using his psychic ability, he found his father reborn in a really nice heaven realm. But his departed mother had been reborn a hungry ghost living in a particularly nasty hell. So Moggallana's father had been very wealthy, and Moggallana himself was pretty wealthy before he became a monk. Well, when his father died, his mother inherited his money, and then Moggallana had left her with all of his wealth when he decided to ordain. Unfortunately, she reacted to all this kindness by becoming very greedy and stingy. So in her life in the next world, he found her sitting in the middle of a fire with a pot of boiling oil on her head. And she was skin and bones because she had nothing to eat or drink. Buddhists have the best hells, by the way. You don't have to believe the hells are states of mind. They're not places you go, but boy, we really have good ones. Anyway, so Moggallana prepared an offering for her, a bowl of rice. And she took the bowl from him and scooped up a handful of food. But before she could get it to her mouth, it turned into burning coals. Well, when he saw this, Moggallana was overcome with sadness. And so he went to the Buddha just in tears and asked him if there was any way he could help. And the Buddha explained that his mother's offenses were deep and were firmly rooted. And although Moggallana's filial devotion resounded throughout heaven and earth, even all the heavenly spirits could do was not enough to help her. But there was a way that he could help his mother. The Buddha said the spiritual power of the assembled Sangha, so all the monks, the nuns, and lay supporters of the 10 directions, is necessary for her liberation to be attained. So let me explain this for a second. When the Buddha was alive, when the rainy season was getting near, the rainy season in India lasts about 3 months, and the monks would find out where the Buddha was staying, and they'd go there to be with them. And they'd all assemble at the monastery for the rainy months, and they'd meditate together and listen to the Dharma and things like that. And while they were there, the lay Buddhists in the area wherever they were staying would go to hear the Dharma, and they'd make offerings to the monks, and they'd practice meditation and all that kind of stuff. So there are all these exceptional people doing all these meritorious things at once. And this would mean that there's a lot of accumulated results of good actions happening during this time. And so the Buddha said, wait till the 15th day of the 7th month, which is right about in the middle of the rainy season. All those devout people would be practicing, and then go make an offering to his ancestors. And he said, for the sake of 7 generations of ancestors, your current parents, those in distress, you should gather food of all flavors and fruit and basins for washing and rinsing and incense and oil lamps, and all these requisites, and take the best things in the world and place them in a bowl and offer them to the assembled monks, those of great virtue for the 10 directions. And he said, in the process of doing this, Moggallana's ancestors would be able to move about, eat, and dress themselves as if they were humans, freed from life as ghosts. So when the time came, the Buddha commanded all the assembled monks to come together and recite mantras and vows for the sakes of the donors' families going back 7 generations. And then after a period of meditation, the monks would accept the offerings. And at that instant, Moggallana's mother obtained liberation from suffering as a hungry ghost. And based on all of this devotion being happened on her behalf, she was reborn into heaven. Well, Moggallana was very happy about that. And so he asked the Buddha, can other followers do the same thing? And the Buddha said, yes, monks and lay people can make offerings like this on behalf of their ancestors this time of year. And then their parents, if living, will have long, happy lives. And any departed ancestors going back 7 generations would benefit from this. If any are hungry ghosts, they'd transcend that realm and be reborn among the deities. And he said, the way to do this is when you make offerings and stuff like that, in every moment of consciousness, you should maintain the thought of your parents, including all your ancestors going back 7 generations. So that's the origin of the Ulumbana service ceremony. So this sounds like a big commitment, keeping your parents and ancestors in mind that way. But it's important, I think, for us to take time to be grateful to those people because we owe them quite a debt. The Pali word for gratitude literally translates to knowing what has been done. So not only are our parents responsible for our lives, but when we look at what's been done by them on our behalf, it's pretty amazing. So I figured this out once. The average infant goes through 4,000 diapers a year. So someone, likely your mother, changed more than 4,000 of your dirty diapers in your first year of life alone. Think about that, with the significance of doing that for somebody. And then if you think about the meals that your mother and father prepared for you or otherwise provided, it's probably about 20,000 during one's childhood. So if a friend said, hey, I'll buy you lunch 20,000 times, that would be a pretty good friend. So the Buddha considered gratitude to those who cared for us so important that he literally felt that someone who was unthankful just didn't have any integrity. And he would talk about the importance of gratitude, especially to our parents. He said, there are 2 people who are very difficult to repay, your mother and father. Even if you were to carry your mother on one shoulder and your father on the other for 100 years, you would not repay your parents. You could establish them in absolute certainty over the entire great earth, and that would not repay your parents for the gift that you received for them. But being grateful to your parents, doesn't just stop there, because their parents had to care for them too. And so the Buddha said the merit we do today can benefit 7 generations of ancestors. So for me to be here talking to you today, my ancestors 7 generations ago had to leave places like England and Ireland and cross the ocean and come to a strange country and work hard and establish life here. And probably your ancestors did similar things so that you could be here today, safe in a good place, practicing the teachings. So many Buddhists consider the importance of teachers and other significant people during this time too. And if you look closely at your life, you realize that you've had help from a lot of other people with whatever that you've accomplished. At Ulumbana ceremonies, people will make offerings to monks in temples, and some go for refuge and take the precepts, and there are other things to do. To create additional merit, some Buddhist cultures avoid eating meat for a while during the month. People will release animals like birds and fish to save them from being harmed. I go to Tomoka Correctional Institution once a week, and we do Buddhist services with a group of men who are incarcerated there. And starting several years ago, we did Soto Zen style Oban services at the prison. And it became one of the most meaningful things that we do there. So during that service, we chant, we name bodhisattvas and our teachers. And then each of the inmates gets a piece of joss paper, which is a coarse piece of paper with gold imprinted on it, a little bit of gold leaf stamped on there. And they write the names of their deceased parents, ancestors, teachers, close friends, people like that. And then one by one, they come up to the altar and they burn it. So the idea is that when you burn it, the gold becomes available for your loved one's use in the afterlife. So in prisons, some of these guys have no contact with their families anymore. And many of them are not available, obviously not able to leave and go attend a loved one's funeral or something like that. So it's hard to imagine, I think, what that's like for someone who's lost a parent and there's nothing they could do about it. Or they've lost friends inside and they don't have funeral services inside. So for a lot of people, it's the only chance to feel close to people that they've lost, from whom they've become so completely separated. So then we take the ashes outside and we scatter them. It's a moment of closure that I think is so profound that a lot of them would otherwise not be able to ever experience. So if you wanted to repay your own ancestors, you can make offerings on their behalf. You don't have to do it at a Buddhist temple. You can make charitable offerings for the sake of an ancestor. You can feed the hungry ghosts. There's instructions available for that kind of thing if you can't get to a Buddhist temple. But anything charitable you do, you can do in the name of your parents and other ancestors. But while we're celebrating our ancestors, we can also spend some time recognizing those hungry ghosts that we encounter in daily life. So, during the COVID era, there were a lot of things that became online like this. And so there were some things that I was able to attend that I probably wouldn't have been able to otherwise. And one of them was a kind of a retreat that Zen Peacemakers International had. And so as part of that, we actually did a Feeding the Hungry Ghost ceremony at LA Zen Center. And during this ceremony, which was pretty straightforward and traditional, much like Feeding the Hungry Ghost ceremonies I've done elsewhere, but being LA, they had to put their little spin on it. And so, the Asian ghosts with the long hair and all of that you see in the Asian horror movies, they had one of their members dressed up that way. It was going around the room as a hungry ghost. It was very interesting. I wasn't real sure how I felt about it when I was watching it, but then afterward, I kind of started feeling a little bit sad because I started to wonder, does this mean they don't believe in hungry ghosts? Does this mean that they don't see the hungry ghosts around them? There's plenty of them. The people who can't resist the pull of sensual desire, which includes drugs and alcohol and things like that, but also addictions to fame, status, addictions to our anger. All those things that we cling to in misguided attempts to satisfy what we feel we're lacking, our cravings. And sometimes we might even see hungry ghosts in our own mirror if we look carefully. So we can recognize those ghosts too and make it a point to help them. And the Buddha said we can do that really by developing conviction, virtue, generosity, and discernment. We can't give someone else those characteristics, but if we develop those qualities in ourselves, we can learn the teachings, practice what we learn so that we can spread the good influence of those lessons to others. At White Sands, by the way, White Sands is a Vietnamese monastery, and we do something that's specifically Vietnamese during our Ulaanbaatar service, which is really interesting and quite moving. This was first done at services by Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. And he was visiting some Western country, I don't remember where, and it happened to be Mother's Day, wherever they were. And there were people who were wearing roses in honor of their mother on Mother's Day. And he was very touched by this. And so he added this into his Ulaanbaatar services. So at White Sands, they picked up on this and they incorporated it too. Actually, lots of Vietnamese communities have. And so toward the end of the service, those of us who are monks go around and distribute roses to people. You get a red one if your mother's still alive and a white one if she's passed. So the significance of this is we learn compassion from our parents. You learn from the compassion you receive for your mother how to be compassionate. and how to be charitable to others. And in doing that, you can allow the nurturing that you receive to spread in larger and larger circles until they ripple throughout the world. And so that way you transform the goodness that you received from your ancestors into goodness for everyone. And the sacrifices made on your behalf then benefit countless beings. So I hope that this was useful to you in some way that you can incorporate into your own spirituality. Thank you for your attention.